Hello students, welcome to Sculpting Portraits. I'm going to show you a couple different ways of sculpting figures, just the face part. So this is one that I did when I was in graduate school that I never actually finished. That's one way that I sculpt currently, and then this is another way that I used to sculpt. I made this right after undergrad. The proportions are really funny, but I thought it would be good to hang on to because there's some good technical construction type of tips that I have with that. When you're sculpting figures or when you're drawing figures or doing any sort of figurative studies, I'm sure you have some sort of this thing. It's a diagram that shows proportions, different scales that are more or less true. Now, they're not hard and fast. They're just guidelines, but I want to show you how they work. So for those that have not sculpted or drawn figures before or followed a proportion guide like this, it may be news to you that the eyes are actually in the center of the entire head. Now, they're not in the center of the face if you're thinking of the face as anything from hairline down, but the top of your head is also an important area in order to figure out where proportions lie and where to put different features of the face. So I'm going to try and line this up with my head, just so you can see how the guidelines more or less work. So this is the guideline, this is my head. I'm lining up my eye line with the guidelines eye line, and then I'm lining up my chin with the bottom of the guideline. And you can see how the eyes are in the center of the face. The bottom of my chin lines up with the bottom of its chin. The top of my hair here lines up with the top of the hair here. You can see how more or less the guidelines of where the bottom of the lip, the bottom of the nose, and where the eyebrow and the hairlines more or less line up with this guideline. I'm going to post this on Canvas as well, so you have a copy of just this, should you want it or need it. Some key features: one, the eyes are in the center of the face, so if you break the head into two parts, the eyes line up in the middle of those. And then I go from the eyes down to start. So from either the center of the eye or the bottom of the eyeball, if you cut that area down into thirds, the first third is going to be the bottom of the nose, the second third is going to be the bottom of the lower lip, and then the third third is going to be from the lower lip to the bottom of the chin. Again, these are guidelines. Not everybody lines up this way, and that's totally fine. The next guide that I do, so I have halves and then I have thirds. I then do, I mark where the eyebrows are. And for me, more or less, it's from the center to the bottom of the eye to the center of the eyebrow line is going to be another third. And then above that is broken into a third from the eyebrow to the hairline, and then above that is another third. So that's how you're breaking up the face, give or take, from top to bottom. Now, you also have to look at left to right. So looking at this, you can see that there's an eyeball here and an eyeball here. What's really cool is that most people's heads are 5 eyeballs wide. So I have an imaginary eyeball between my eyes, and it's the same proportion as both of my eyes. And then if my hair was flat against my head, you would see that from the corner of this eye to the very side of my head, from this angle only, is another eye, and then there's another eye here. And you can see those proportions there. Those proportions only work when you're looking at a person or a figure straight on. The width of the eye in between your eyes will give you the width of your nose. Not always. I think that's the most inaccurate for a lot of people, is that proportion. Again, this is just a guideline. One guideline that does seem to be more accurate than the nose width is going to be if your person is looking straight ahead from the inside of the iris to the inside of the iris. If you draw lines straight down, like you see here, they'll more or less line up with the corners of your mouth. So that can help you create the proper width for that. Again, if you're trying to sculpt a particular person or sculpt yourself, you'll have to double check these guidelines with your actual proportions and make sure that those either line up or you know how they differ and sculpt that way. The chin, I can never figure out the best way to do the chin, so I just sculpt it until it looks right. Yeah, so that's proportions on that. So when you're sculpting, it might be a little bit difficult to take the 2D and translate it to the 3D. So I have this head that I bought from some craft store, probably Michael's. And I've drawn in where the eye is, where the nose more or less lines up. This is a really wide nose and it's weird. But you can see that I have some of these same proportions. And I'll hold this up again. I'll get my head in there too, so I can see the camera. You can see how more or less those proportions line up. Now this is a lot smaller than this, so it's gonna look a little weird. But eye, center eye, mouth to iris, 1, 2, 3, yeah, more or less. So I don't use this as a guideline for proportions. I do use this as a thing to put my clay on top of so that I don't have to use a solid block of clay and then sculpt that way. I can use this as kind of an internal support until the clay is stiff enough to hold itself up. You'll also see that I have some lines drawn on the side. So this is the second part of the proportion guideline, noting where to put the ears and then at what angle to attach the ears or sculpt the ears from. So you can see how the center of the eye doesn't line up perfectly with the top of the ear. The top of the ear more or less actually lines up with the top of the eye or the eyelid or the eyeball, anything like that. So you can see how a straight line going back from the top of the eye lines up with the top of the ear. Some people will say that the top of the ear lines up with the eyebrow. Some of those proportions are going to be a little bit weird, and that's entirely on how the head is positioned. So the proportions that I use are based on the head being perfectly up and down, and it's not necessarily up and down with like this part of the face being flat. It's actually focusing on the zygomatic bone or your cheekbone as it recedes back. So if this is horizontal, then these are going to be maybe not super accurate. Most people don't actually hold their head like perfectly upright. I tend to like hold my head in a bunch of different ways. So these proportions are a little bit different the way that I see them when I'm looking at myself. But if this bone is horizontal, and this is your ear canal, and this is your occipital opening, that's where the eye goes. So your ear, let me expose mine. Your ear is going to have the hole down here. So you still have all of this nice, meaty wonderfulness that's going to be positioned above that ear hole. And that's what you're measuring. You're not necessarily measuring this. So check your proportions with what you see, sculpt what you see, not necessarily what you know, unless you're following all of these guidelines, like I do. What other fun things? I think that's it. Let's move on to actually sculpting. I'm going to switch camera angles.
So these are the basic tools for sculpting a figure. Anything that's anything like these, oh, and clay. Anything that's like these is going to be a good start. I use a lot of specialty tools when I get into refining, but this is good for just starting it out. I take a piece of clay and I create a slab with it. Takes a while. It's a little noisy, so I'm going to go do it somewhere else. Bam, slab. Okay. And to smooth it out, you want to make sure that you're compressing both sides. So flip it over, compress, 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 compress. Make all of those canvas marks go away. This is Fred the head. I'm taking some clay off of my slab and I'm going to create these little blobs of clay that will hold Fred in place. He's styrofoam and likes to roll around, so I'm going to make sure that he stays right where I tell him to go. And do a little more sturdy, and let's cover his face. Slap, slap, slap. Make sure that the clay is nice and compressed all the way around so that it sticks. And I'm just paddling to make everything a little bit smoother. And right now I'm working on getting the clay to wrap around the chin and the neck a little bit. It's off camera, so it's hard to see. A little more. And I'm taking my serrated rib and I'm just kind of roughing up the entire surface of this slab. I find that I have less cracking if I do this step. And it also sets up the directionality of the underlying muscles. So I'm taking this smooth rib and I'm just kind of smoothing everything out ever so slightly, really compressing all of those clay particles. I have an idea of how I want to move forward with this figure, so just smoothing out, creating a nice even canvas. I first start by marking where the eye sockets are. This is my little handy diagram. And I immediately start with building up areas that are a little bit flat. So I'm focusing on building up the nose, building up the eyebrows, and building up some of the cheekbones. And that really solidifies the placement of the eye sockets within this form. Now, since I'm sculpting on top of Fred the head, there's already kind of an idea of where that placement is. So this step is really just solidifying where those eye sockets are and then building them up. When we sculpt the eyes later, it's good to have the eye sockets pretty deep set because of the way that I sculpt eyes. So if you're starting with a really deep socket, you're going to be in a good place. So I'm smoothing out the nose a little bit, adding a little bit more clay where necessary, making sure those eye sockets are really where I want them to be. I'm drawing that center line that marks where the center of the eyes are, marking it on the nose, and then I'm cutting between the center of the eye and the chin into thirds. And then in that second third, I'm cutting that in half and then cutting that half in another half, and that shows me where the mouth is going to be. Your iris is a third of your eyeball as a whole, and this is the size that the eyeball actually is in your head. And I'm using that to mark where the corner of my mouth should be. I kind of eyeballed it. This is Harry the Scary. He's my skull model. I'm going to use him next to Fred the head. It's just a way to look at the different bone structures that are in the face. So I know that I need to build up the cheekbones a little bit more because Harry's cheekbones are a little bit more prominent. The mouth, I know, needs to be built forward a little bit. And between the mouth and the nose, there's those wonderful mouth muscles that actually connect two parts of the nose. And then those areas underneath the bottom lip are more mouth muscles. So I'm building up all of these bone areas and then areas where I know that muscles attach. These two coils of clay that I'm attaching from the center of the brow ridge upwards, those are actually where your chewing muscles in your jaw end. They go up underneath your cheekbones and then attach to there. So I'm building up that area, building up the chin, building up the jaw a little bit more. Bye, Harry. So I'm adding some water so that it's a little bit easier when I go and smooth everything out. Slip and score, don't forget. So I'm trying to maintain that amount of mass in those areas. So I'm just focusing on smoothing out the very edges of all of these little coils and blobs of clay, trying to smooth everything out, make all of the planes match again, but still maintain all of those high points that I built up from the coils. Add a little bit of water, add a little bit more clay where I feel like I need to. This is just to build up the cheek muscles that attach down to the mouth, making sure that my eye sockets stay very hollow. Adding some clay to the nose to make it a little bit wider. making sure that the bridge of the nose gracefully flows into the cheekbone. And you can't forget to add the philtrum. It's that little area right above your cupid's bow. That basically connects your tip of your nose to your cupid's bow, and then adding a little bit more structure within the nose and within the upper lip. More to the bridge of the nose. Smooth, smooth. I'm just going to smooth out the other side and then move along. So after my first pass of building up, I found some areas that are still a little bit low. So I'm just adding a little bit more clay to build up those areas so that the figure is at least symmetrical-ish. And I'm going to go through and smooth all of that down as well. Once that's done, I'm going to make sure that my eye sockets are still nice and hollow. Add some last minute building up touches. Smoothing out some of the work I've done so far just so I can get a better idea of how well I've built everything up. Kind of cleaning up my canvas a little bit. And then I can start getting into some of the details. So I'm creating nostrils. I'm creating the flaps around the nostrils just using my fingers because they're about the right shape and a pretty good intuitive tool to use. I'm creating those lines, those smile lines down from the corners of the nose to the jaw around the mouth. And adding a little bit more to the chin because the mouth got a little bit low. So now I'm going to start building up the mouth. I'm building up the bottom lip first, just adding a little bit more clay to bring that part of the face forward, slipping and scoring, making sure everything's nice and attached. And the lip's a little low right now, so I'm going to go back in and kind of push it up from where the chin is to kind of bring it back into proportions. And I'm going to go in and kind of mark where the lips meet. And I'm just using this wooden tool to kind of push the clay around to create the planes of the lips. So I'm not carving at this point because the clay is still wet, but I can push the clay around to create the planes rather than carving those planes out. This is still just pushing the clay around. If you focus on the corners of the mouth, you can create different expressions with a very subtle touch with how you're creating that corner of the mouth. Don't forget the philtrum. Making sure that the mouth muscles connect to the nose, everything's connected. Adding a little bit more to the chin. The mouth ended up being a little bit lower than I would have liked. Just adding a little bit more clay there. Smooth, smooth, smooth. And kind of refining some of those muscle structures within the face. I use both of my hands as evenly as possible, and that helps create symmetry, and I'm also able to sculpt 2 times faster. So re-emphasizing where the center of my eyes are, drawing a line back so I can start to work on sculpting the ears. Now this isn't usually how I sculpt ears, but this is a way to, if you're wanting to focus on the proportions of the ears as you're looking at the figure from straight on. This is a good way to kind of map things out, which is why I'm not showing you details of how I'm sculpting the ears, because I will do that again later. Pinchy, pinch, pinch. What's nice about working with wet clay is you don't have to slip and score. as long as you're compressing and pinching the clay together really well. Making sure that my earlobe is not too low, so I'm drawing a line from the bottom of the earlobe to the bottom of the nose, and then the top of the ear to the eyebrow or the top of the eye. Or I'm throwing in a way to sculpt an eyebrow. If you want like a really nice bushy brow, you can add a little bit of clay and then add some texture to it. This is for like power brow. And then just cleaning that up a little bit. This is just a placeholder for now. And I'm going to move on to a profile view so you can see where the ear is in relation to the eyes and the nose and the rest of the face. And I'm going to go ahead and build up the back side of the head as well. So I'm just taking some slabs, making them a little bit thinner than what I had prepared for myself. Making sure that it fits, slipping and scoring, and attaching that. Use the paddle to make sure everything's nice and compressed and really attached, and then I'm using my serrated rib to fully connect everything. I'm going to do that on the bottom half of the head as well. So I decided the ear is kind of in the way, so I'm just going to take it off. I'm going to redo it anyway. And I'm just going to smooth out this side of the head, make sure all of those slabs of clay are really compressed and attached. And then I'm going to go ahead and smooth out that whole side of the head. Adding clay where it's a little thin. So I'm looking at my profile diagram, getting that set up so I can see where I need to add or subtract anything, cleaning up my canvas. And I'm using my little wooden stick here to quickly draw those lines from the eye back so I can see where the ear is supposed to be, and then also the angle and the shape of the jaw. Harry's back. Welcome back, Harry. So I'm scoring the jawline because I'm going to add a little bit more clay there to kind of build up that bone structure a little bit more. Making sure to incorporate all of that really well. Add a little bit more to the chin. Add a little bit more to the nose, to the bridge of the nose. And because the clay is still pretty wet, I can just squish that nose down. I'm adding some more clay to the forehead. I just feel like there needs to be a little bit more in the forehead to kind of square out the front of the face. I'm making a little wedge of clay, and that's going to be my ear. So you can make matching ears by making a heart out of clay and then cutting it in half. And then you want to make sure that you have the forward part of the ear a little bit thinner so that the back part of the ear sticks out. And I'm just going in and I'm drawing a preliminary carving of what the folds of the ear look like. Everybody's ears are a little different, but there's generally the same kind of folding. Now I'm lining it up with the angle of the jaw, and then I'm scoring where that attachment is going to be, slipping, and then I'm squeezing all of those potential air bubbles out and making sure that that's really connected. Using a wooden knife to get to areas where my fingers can't quite reach, and then I'm using a fine serrated rib to make sure that that attachment is really strong around the edges. And I'm going to go back in and kind of refine the carvings of the ear. And I'm really focusing on making sure that that ear looks like it's incorporated into the head and not just attached. bit more shaping, little pinchy pinchy. And I'm looking at the angle from the chin to the tip of the nose. And with most people, if you hold a line between the tip of the nose and the chin, one of the lips or both of the lips is going to line up with that. So the chin was a little bit too far forward, so I kind of pushed it back a little bit with my hand. And I'm adding a little bit more underneath the chin as well. So that bone that protrudes directly underneath the ear canal is called the mastoid process, and there's a giant tendon that connects from that all the way to the center of your collarbone in the front, and that's the giant tendon or the giant muscle that's able to help you turn your head from side to side. I'm using a coil to mark that in, kind of build up that musculature a little bit more, and I'm adding a little bit of clay to create more of an Adam's apple as well. Going in, refining the shape of the chin from my profile view and smoothing everything out. I like to draw an X on the cheek. That helps me figure out where I need to do any sort of contouring. And I can kind of just push the clay in, add clay where I pushed in too far, and smooth all of that out. Adding a little bit of clay in front of the ear to kind of help incorporate that ear into the face a little bit. And now I'm refining the apple of the cheek, just by pushing clay around with my thumb and smoothing that around. Bye, Harry. So now we're at a 3/4 view. It's important to move your figure around a lot and look at your figure from a bunch of different angles. I'm smoothing out that clay that was on the forehead, or that I added to the forehead. The eyebrow's distracting me a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. Making sure I'm happy with the clay that I added to the nose. I'm going to add a little bit more clay to the front of the head to build up that chewing muscle. And do the same on the other side as well. And I'm just making sure that all of that clay is nice and incorporated. So now I'm at the point where I can start doing a little bit of refining. So now I'm making sure that I'm happy with the chin and the way that the mouth evolves into the chin. And I've decided that I want to make this head a wall piece. So I've thrown another slab. Making sure that it's compressed on this side, and then I flip it over and make sure it's compressed on this side. And now for the fun part. So the clay is stiffened up a little bit on Fred. So I'm going to cut away all of the excess clay that I have. I'm using my ruler to kind of line up a line that's going to be parallel to the tabletop so that I know that I have a nice horizontal line that I'm cutting off of. And I'm using a little cutting tool or a little blade to kind of mark where that line is going to be. You can see it there briefly. I'm going to do that to the other side. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut all of that excess clay off. Once all of that excess clay is cut off, I'm going to very carefully pry my sculpture off of Fred the Head. You want to make sure that the clay is stiff enough that it'll hold its shape, so pretty close to leather hard or at leather hard. That way you don't distort your sculpture when you're getting it off of this form. Finally, I'm going to place that there, making sure that everything's lined up, that I didn't distort it too much. And then I'm going to go ahead and trace around the outside of my figure so that I know where I need to slip and score. Put that to the side, do all my little scoring. And while I have an area to put my hand inside of the head, I'm going to work on the eyes. So I like to make sure that the eye sockets are really deep and hollow. And then I'm going to go in and cut a line all the way through. That's going to be the opening of the eyelid. And I'm taking this little doll eye tool, this ball, and I'm using that to press the shape of the eyeball out through the inside of the figure. And it creates a nice, perfectly round eyeball shape in a very short amount of time. And I'm just using this little wooden tool to kind of refine the tear duct. And I'm going to do the same on the other side. Making sure my proportions are accurate. And I'm just using my finger to push this eye out. It's not as efficient, but sometimes I feel like I have more control. And then cleaning up the tear duct on this side as well. I'm also going to do something similar with the mouth. I like to make the mouth look like it's ever so slightly open if I leave the eyes closed. I'm just cutting through all the way to the inside with this little tiny blade, wiggling it around so that there's some nice rounded edges on the inside and the outside of the lips, and then refining the shape of the cheeks and of the mouth. And I'm going to go ahead and score the backside of the figure, slip and score, and I'm adding these little support coils on the back slab. This does two things. One, it creates more surface area for that attachment point, and then it also creates a barrier so that I can't squish the figure too far in. When building this way, it's really hard to get your hand on the inside of the figure without cutting a hole to push anything out. So this is kind of acting as a barricade as well, and I'm making sure that that's nice and incorporated with my serrated rib. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of slip or water, and then attach my head to this back wall piece. I'm making sure to compress as best as I can, but still be kind of tender. And then I'm going to go ahead and add some support coils around that seam just to make sure that I have a really good connection between these two pieces. Cut off some of this excess slab on the back here, and then I can reuse that to create some more support coils. And then I'm using my serrated rib to make sure that all of that is nice and incorporated. Really paying attention to making that seam as strong as possible and as smooth as possible. Cutting off some excess clay on this side. And then I'm finishing off adding any clay, subtracting any clay that I really don't need and smoothing all of that out. And now I'm going in and I'm just finalizing that general shaping between where the figure interacts with the wall, making sure that that's all nice and round, and it gives it a little bit more form. It makes it look a lot less flat. I'm doing that on the side you can't see as well. So now I can go in with my fine serrated rib. You can do this with a smooth rib as well. And I'm just refining some of those pieces of clay that have moved around or have attached. And I'm creating more of a general musculature patterning. So now that the clay is kind of set up and I'm done adding clay, I can go in and I can start subtracting clay and refine all of the details. I have this tiny little serrated pick kind of thing that I like to use. It allows me to take off a little bit of clay at a time, and it's almost like a file, and I can get into some pretty hard to reach areas. It's great for the beginning of detailing. I'm just working on refining the shapes of the muscles around the nose and around the mouth. And you'll see how I kind of jump around the face. I don't stay in one part of the face for too long, and that helps me not focus on one area and end up having a nose and then a mouth. It's a nose and mouth combo, if that makes sense. So the more you can move around your piece, the more cohesive it's going to look with itself. So I've zoomed in a little bit so that you can see more of the detailing that I'm doing around the mouth. Just taking off a little bit at a time, trying to find just the right shape for everything. Whenever you're sculpting a mouth, you don't want to draw a line. You do want to have just like a planar shift in order to get that differentiation between the type of skin that makes up the lip and the type of skin that makes up the rest of your face. So it's just a subtle planar shift rather than a line that draws the outline of the lips. So that's it. Ooh, wow. Ah, special. Wow. So I've zoomed in on the ears so that we can do some finalizing of the detail work within the ear. I'm taking my tiny little file rasp detailing whatever tool, and I'm just slowly shaving off areas that I don't need, making sure that I'm maintaining proportions still, smoothing out any rough textures that I don't need, and then I can slowly start shaving down the outside of the ear that's a little too fat for my liking. And then making sure that that connection behind the ear is nice and smooth and still is nice and strong. Really cleaning out any of the gunk that ended up in the ear canal. So now we're at the the finishing, so this is a step that I usually skip because I like to have a lot of texture on my sculptures, but in the event that you're more interested in having a nice smooth surface, think of it as sandpaper. So I use this cheap yellow sponge to do the majority of the smoothing, so you can think of it as like 60 grit sandpaper. And I'm just adding a little bit of water to it, and it smooths down all of my serrated rib markings. And then I have this little Mudtools finishing sponge, and I'm adding water to it. And when you add water, it makes it a little bit more flexible. And I'm just using that as like a 200 grit sandpaper, and I'm smoothing all of the areas that I couldn't reach with the yellow sponge. And then I'm taking an acrylic bristle brush to do all of the super hard to reach areas. I like the acrylic bristles because they're super soft, so they don't leave a lot of brush strokes, but they have a stiffness to them, so even when they're wet, they kind of hold their shape and I can still move the clay around with them. If I was using a natural bristle brush, like an oil painting brush, I would leave too many brush strokes. For the skin, it would be good for making hair. And if I was using like a watercolor brush, it would just put water everywhere. It wouldn't really push the clay around like I would want it to. I have those rubber tipped tools in the left-hand side of the screen. Those are really great for finishing as well. I like these because I can get some nice little detail areas. I can also use this wooden tool that I have to do some detail work. And that's it. At this point, you could go in and add hair, add wrinkles, or change the features however you want to in order to make your figure exactly how you want it to look. Right? Thanks for watching.